Hi church, welcome to our first online academy. We're really glad that you have joined us. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, then join us on our church online platform where you can join the conversation. Here is Roy Turner bringing us our first instalment of the teaching on doubt.
Well, welcome everybody to our third series of workshops. This is a workshop, so hopefully you'll be able to feedback your comments in some form or another, which the technical people I'm sure will facilitate. And this particular series we're going to be talking about the elephant in the room subject, if you like, the subject of doubt. And the subject of doubt is something that many Christians do not like to think about too much. So let's just dive in. Just talk about us as human beings. Now, we are incredibly complex, physical, psychological, spiritual beings, and we have this huge cerebral cortex in our heads that enables us to do something rather special that no other species can do, and that is to think. And we can think about the deep mysteries of life and the meaning of faith and all these things that God has given to us as a gift. So in terms of thinking, I'm a person, and I hope you are too, who is naturally drawn to thinking about my faith and why I believe what I believe. And you know, contrary to some people's views, the life of faith and thinking and the life of thought are not really opposite ends of the spectrum. In fact, they go hand in hand together. So there's no problem there at all. Where there is a problem, however, is when we think that our thinking about God has to be correct. Our thinking, I've got to get God right, my theology, my doctrine has got to be precisely correct in order that I can have a right relationship with God. Put another way, our problem is often trusting our beliefs rather than trusting God. And, you know, for many religious people, being right about God gives us a sense of reassurance in, you know, a rather sort of messy world that we live in. But resting on our beliefs is actually can be quite a dangerous thing to do. It's a precarious thing to do, because if we are suddenly confronted with the possibility that we are wrong about something, our faith can be severely shaken. And if it is severely shaken, then it just means that we are, at that particular moment, we are not trusting in God, but we're trusting in our belief system and disguising it as trusting in God. So these workshops will focus on faith, not defined by what we believe, but in whom we trust. And our assumption will be that faith is not a what word, but a who word. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why is he introducing a workshop on the subject of doubt by emphasising the difference between trust and belief? Well, the reason is this. If your faith is defined by what you believe, your faith is a disaster waiting to happen, because all it takes to ruin such faith is a better argument. And believe me, there are lots of better arguments out there somewhere. And when you're exposed to that better argument, your belief-based faith takes a hammering, and something called doubt sets in. Now, actually, what we shall learn over the next 2 or 3 weeks is that having such doubts is not a bad thing at all. In fact, having a crisis of doubt, if you like, could be the making of us. You see, when we hold beliefs lightly, we are never afraid of better arguments. In fact, we are able to embrace them. And there are many aspects of the Christian faith that I have changed my mind about over the years. And I've changed them because wiser people than me, in the main biblical scholars who have spent their whole lives studying the Bible, have shown me that my understanding of certain aspects of my faith are wrong, are flawed. And then, you know what I have to do? I have to go down on my knees and ask God to forgive me, because 15 years or so ago, I was teaching the good people of LCF stuff that I no longer believe in. So I ask your forgiveness if you were around at that time too. You see, what I'm really saying is this, that faith is a journey, should be a journey of discovery, which only really ends when we die. So I freely admit to you that my faith morphs all the time. You know, it morphs from, I know what I believe, to, I think I know what I believe. And then it's, I think I knew what I believe. I'm not so sure anymore. Honestly, I've no idea. Leave me alone. Has anybody sort of had that sort of experience? Now, on the question of doubt, let me share with you a very interesting observation, and it's this. In my own personal life, when I summoned up the courage to ask, to share with 1 or 2 Christians about how I was struggling and questioning some of the things that I had been taught as a young Christian, I was made aware that this was not considered to be a healthy or helpful thing to do. And it was made subtly, well, not so subtly in some cases, clear to me that questioning was a definite no-no. And I am pretty sure that my name began to pop up on lots of people's prayer lists throughout the church. In fact, I know it did. Now, the negative reaction that I experienced to my questions and, yes, my doubts could well have led to a crisis in my faith. In fact, it very nearly led to my leaving the church. And the only reason that this did not happen is that I had spent my whole Christian life studying the Bible. It's sort of in my DNA. And I happen to know that virtually every significant character in the Bible that did great deeds, maybe, but they all suffered from doubt and questions about God and about God's word. And that's a fact. That is just a fact. And so, knowing that, I had to ask myself this question. Why was something that happened to virtually all the great heroes of faith in the scriptures so frowned upon by modern Christians? Interesting question. So, Why are we having workshops on doubt? Well, this is the reason. Because I am convinced that, and you can certainly voice your views on this later, that in the Western Church we take a strangely unbiblical approach to this whole question of doubt in its various forms. In fact, I'll go so far as to say this. Quite often, the most risky place to be spiritually honest is the church. And that's a shame. It's a shame for new Christians who often struggle after the honeymoon period of their initial conversion. It's a shame for mature Christians because never doubting invariably means that they stopped growing. And it's a shame, often tragic, for church leaders who fear they can never voice their doubts or struggles because there's a myth abroad in the church that this would represent some sort of failure. So church leaders just have to struggle through keeping up appearances or risk public shame, not to mention their monthly salary. So how important is it, especially for leaders, to have close, committed relationships with one or two people at least, to whom they can unburden and they can pour out what they're really feeling in times of trouble. And I'm certainly glad that I had one or two people like that in my journey of faith. So how much healthier would it be if we only stopped, or if we only dropped all this pretense of certainty and started being honest with one another about the things that really trouble us when the crowds have gone home and we're left alone to our private thoughts? What about you? Have you ever felt that you would like to ask some questions about why these things are happening in your life? Why you're so discouraged? Or have you been told that such questioning is not safe Christian conduct, and that it would make, all these questions would make God very disappointed and maybe quite angry? Okay, so I've set the scene, and no doubt you'll want me to explain and justify my, maybe some think, a controversial view that the church's approach to doubt is somewhat unbiblical. So I want to do that in this first session by focusing on one aspect of believers' lives, and that is the teaching and particularly the worship of God's people in the Bible. Now, the people of Israel in the Old Testament and the early church in the New Testament actually shared a common hymn book. I don't know whether you know that. They shared a common hymn book. They didn't sing choruses from Hillsongs or hymns from hymns ancient and modern. They had their own hymn book called the Book of Psalms. And this book of 150 psalms were the centerpiece of Jewish worship. And when they met together, the psalms would become their liturgy, if you like. The whole service would be framed around the psalms. And they would read from them, and they would sing them just as we sing our choruses and our hymns today. And this would happen in the temple, it would happen in the synagogue, it would happen in the early church house groups, and of course individuals would meditate on the Psalms, and they would sing the Psalms on their own. Now, just as a bit of background, let me just explain to you just a little bit of information about the Psalms. There are basically 5 types of Psalms. There were praise Psalms, Psalm 8 and 145, for example. There were thanksgiving Psalms, Psalm 30, 32 and 34. There were royal Psalms which celebrated the kingship of God. Psalms 18, 47, 93, for example. And then there were wisdom Psalms which celebrated various aspects of wisdom. Psalm 1, Psalm 37. And then finally, there were what are called the Psalms of Lament or Complaint. Psalm 3, 44, 74. Now it's interesting, given those 5 types of Psalms, that the most frequently occurring type of Psalm is the Psalm of Lament. In fact, 42, getting on for 1/3 of the Israelite hymn book, comprised these Psalms of Lament and Complaint. And in these 42 Psalms, the psalmists do not hold back. Why have you forgotten me? Psalm 42 verse 9 says. My bones suffer mortal agony and my enemies taunt me, it says in verse 10. Why are you so downcast, O my soul? Verse 11. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Psalm 13 verse 1. The Psalms are full of whys. How longs? Where are you, God? And David cries out himself in Psalm 38 verses 21 and 22. He says, O Lord, do not forsake me. Do not be far from me, O my God. Come quickly to help me, O Lord, my Saviour. And then the psalmist of Psalm 42 cries out in despair, and he says, my tears have been my food. That's all I do, in other words, day and night, while men say to me all day long, where is your God? Where is he? He's not there to help you. And of course, Jesus famously quoted on the cross from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry out to you by day, but you do not answer. How long? Why? Where are you? Why do you ignore me? This is the sort of experience suffered by the heroes of faith. I don't know whether you read Jeremiah lately, but you could actually end up fearing for his mental state. Such was his agony of soul. People told him, people that God had told him to prophesy to regarding the future exile. And people said to him, you're no prophet, you're no prophet. And God had commissioned him to say these things and then had left him high and dry. Jeremiah kept saying, well, where are you, God? You've told me, you called me to be a prophet, you've called me to give a message, and then you disappear. You're nowhere to be seen or heard. And then there's Job, of course. Wow, let's not go there. But my point is this, the recorded agonies of Jeremiah, Job are one thing, but the despair, the complaint, the desperate unanswered questions that we have just read from earlier are from the hymn book of the people of God. And here's the point. Their expressions of despair, their pain, their doubts were central to their worship. They hymned their complaints. They chorused their doubts. And they sung their disappointments of God. Here's the point. Or let me ask a question. Why did they do this? Why did they sing their doubts and their complaints to God? Why did they incorporate their doubts and fears and their disappointments and their anger at God into the very centre of their worship? Well, maybe they did it because that is part and parcel of a healthy life of faith. Question. Now, it's interesting that none of the main hymn books in Western Christendom include in any way the genre of lament or complaint. That's interesting, isn't it? Lament and complaint has been excluded from man's relationship with God in terms of the church's worship. It completely disappeared from prayer and worship in the modern church. And that's interesting. See, why then is it that it is the words of just such a lament that come from the lips of Jesus? Why is it that there are many people in the church today who seem to be able to relate to the psalmist? They can relate to them. And they can say, yeah, I'm in that sort of situation. I have these real doubts about these traditional certainties that we are all supposed to believe in. I'm actually being crushed by the bitter reality of evil and suffering in my life. My prayers don't seem to be answered. They just seem to go up to the ceiling and there's silence. They're asking the same questions which haunted the psalmists. Why and how long, O God? Now, consider our worship today in the 21st century church. As I've mentioned to you, we do not tend to hymn our doubts, our sorrows, our unanswered questions in the great assembly of the saints, do we? Why don't we do that? Well, no doubt the thinking might be is that we come to church to strengthen one another by our enthusiastic faith. We don't come to bring negativity and voice our complaints and anger against God, because that would just bring discouragement to the church. We want to leave church every week on a high to tide us through the week to the next Sunday. Yeah? Now, I am reminded of the great German pastor, theologian and philosopher, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a great man of God. He stood up against Hitler and all he stood for. And sadly, Bonhoeffer was martyred by the Nazis only a couple of days before the end of the Second World War. And near the end of his life, he wrote that in his view, God had largely been reduced by the church to the status of a psychological crutch. Now, I think he was partly speaking into our subject tonight. It's common, isn't it, for young children to carry around with them some form of comfort blanket. Now, I used to have a comfort blanket of sorts in the form of a cloth puppet. It was a character that none of you would have heard of because I'm so ancient, but it was a cloth puppet of Archie Andrews. And I used to carry this round with me everywhere, and I used to go to bed with Archie Andrews. It just provided a comfort. Layla, one of my granddaughters, takes Blanky. Blanky is a bit of woolen blanket. She takes Blanky with her everywhere, and she cannot go to sleep without Blanky. Now, relating this to church, imagine Liz leading worship one morning, and leading us in a string of songs that express the doubts that some people are feeling in the congregation, the sense of abandonment that others are feeling. And these songs complain to God that when he's needed, he's never there. And this is the theme of the worship this Sunday morning. What would be the reaction of the good people of LCF? You see, a spiritually healthy church would connect with that and be able to enter into the honesty of what was being expressed. However, if we have become accustomed to the church providing a comfort blanket every week, the worship leader's ministry will fill us with deep anxiety, maybe even anger. But we are people of the word, you see. We are people of the word. And the psalmists do regularly hymn their doubts and openly voice their troubles. And it's not obvious at all that this voicing of their troubles, their laments, their complaints, harmed their faith whatsoever. Question: are our hymns, worship songs, truly representative of all aspects of the faith tradition that we hold? Now, you may be thinking this. You may be thinking, okay, sing out doubts in worship, yeah, I get that. I can see that the Israelites certainly did this. The early church did it as well, including Jesus and Paul. But what good? What good can that really do? Okay, that is if you're asking that question, that's a fair question. So I want to try and answer that question by looking at 3 psalmists. And if you've got your Bibles with you, you might want to look these up as we go through them. Looking at Psalms of Lament. First example comes from Psalm 37. Now, if you want to look that up, you can follow what I'm saying in that. But one of the common themes of complaint by the ancient Israelites was this: why do the wicked prosper? Because it's just not fair. We're faithful to God. We worship God. And our lives are so difficult at times. In fact, God seems to disappear at times. Yet the wicked, who flout all the rules and they do horrible things, they're seeming to prosper. Why? And this psalm is one of many that addresses this particular problem. So in Psalm 37, verse 1, the psalmist says, "Do not fret because of evil men, or be envious of those who do wrong." Now it's evident from this and many other psalms that there were evil, nasty people in their community who, contrary to all expectations, were doing rather well for themselves and succeeding to such an extent that others were envious of their success. So we're told in verse 14 that they had power, and in verse 16 they had great wealth, and all this was being enjoyed by wicked people. Many of the righteous, on the other hand, they're living in comparative poverty, facing difficulties and times of trouble. And what's more, they were vulnerable, the Psalms say, to the attacks of the wicked. Now, the psalmist's basic assumption is to try and explain this unsatisfactory situation by thinking like this. They're thinking, and it's expressed in verse 2 of this Psalm 37. It says this: "For like the grass, they will soon wither. Like green plants, they will soon die away. So the psalmist comforts himself with the traditional teaching found in many parts of the Old Testament, particularly the wisdom literature, that the success of the wicked is purely transitory. Men may act in evil, in selfish ways for a time, but sooner or later they come face to face with the one certainty in life, which of course is death. Death, the inescapable leveller, whom no amount of money can buy off. Now, just a brief explanation here. The Hebrew people had a very, you can only say blasé view on death. For them, it didn't seem to be a big issue. In fact, it was just accepted. They shared this attitude with other cultures of the time in the ancient Near East. And the Hebrews believed in this shadowy netherworld to which all dead people go down to at death. And this place was called Sheol. Various synonyms are used in the Old Testament to describe what Sheol might be like, and they're all decidedly negative. So Sheol is described as the pit in one place, Abaddon, which means destruction, in another, the darkness, etc., etc. So everyone went there. Everyone went there. There was no concept of heaven for the righteous and hell for the sinners that we're so familiar with today as Christians. So the writer of Psalm 37 was describing the traditionally accepted view of the time that evil doers would go to the same place as everyone else. So there will be a levelling up or levelling down, if you like. And that's the one thing that they relied on. That's, okay, the wicked are prospering now, but they'll go to the same place as us. That was the thinking, that was the teaching in the Old Testament. Turn now to Psalm 49. And this writer, again, is referring to this same issue. Says in verse 5, "Why should I fear when evil days come, when wicked deceivers surround me?" And then he reiterates the traditional thinking that I've just described, that death will bring a levelling up. In verse 14 he says, "Like sheep they are destined for the grave, and death will feed on them. Their bodies will decay in the grave, far from their princely mansions." So, no surprise there. It's the same traditional Hebrew understanding and teaching. But then in verse 15 comes what can only be described as a revelation. The psalmist says this. He says, "But God will redeem my life from the grave. He will surely take me to himself." Well, that's a revelation that came to him. This was not in Hebrew theology. There was no theology in his time that taught that. And so it seems that he had had a revelation, a conviction that there must be a greater power than Sheol. And that, of course, was God. So he was a man whose underlying faith in God was so strong that he was willing to reject the traditional Hebrew teaching on death and proclaim to God, "No, I'm not accepting that. You, my God, will redeem me from Sheol." And that came out of his doubt. And finally, in the ancient workshop worship, I want to take you to Psalm 73. So if you want to look that one up, those of you who are following with your Bibles. This psalmist is in despair. Verse 2, he pours out his life to God, pours out his thoughts about the unfairness of life. He says, "But as for me, my feet had almost slipped. I had nearly lost my foothold. In other words, he was saying that he was on the point of losing his faith. He had got to that stage. For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity, the shalom of the wicked. They have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They're not plagued by human ills. Verse 13 says, surely in vain I have kept my heart pure. In vain I have washed my hands in innocence. All day long I have been plagued. I have been punished every morning. So this guy is telling God that he is green with envy at the wicked. He's fed up. For this psalmist, the only reward to being faithful is just more suffering. More suffering. God, nowhere to be found. But look what happens. In the face of all his complaints about the wicked, he doesn't ask the obvious question that most of the other psalmists do. He doesn't say, why do the wicked suffer? He raises a far more fundamental question. So paraphrasing verse 13 and 14, basically what he's saying is this. What is the meaning of faith? Is there any point in continuing to believe and to pursue a godly life when all that happens is just more suffering? Wouldn't it make more sense to assume that the world makes no sense and to renounce my faith in God? He's on the point of giving up. Anyone else been there? And then he hesitates and he says this in verse 15. He says this, if I had said I will speak thus, I would have betrayed your children. In some versions it says, I would have betrayed the family of God. So what is happening here, he realises that if he decides that his faith is pointless, it follows that the whole company of people he worships with are deluded. And that's not a conclusion that he's prepared to draw. Do you see what's happening here? His personal doubts, as troubling as they are being held in check by his faith community. Many people, including myself, experience the same thing. The faith of others has kept us from losing ours. And it's one of the most compelling reasons for belonging to a believing community. Let us not give up meeting together, but let us encourage one another. Hebrews 10 and verse 25. You see, here is a man whose doubts took him right to the edge, but those doubts eventually were the saving of him, because he realises two things. First thing he realises is that faith did not depend on his grasp of God, but on God's grasp of him. And secondly, that the essence of faith is a relationship with God which nothing can break, and in the light of which everything else just pales into insignificance. This man reached the point of being able to see that the success of the wicked is an irrelevance. Doesn't matter. Even if the wicked do flourish, I've got something that they can never have, a relationship with a living God. And if this man had never been compelled by a clear-headed analysis of experience to question the traditional teaching which nurtured him, if he had not been driven to doubt whether faith had any value at all, he would never have broken through to a deeper faith. Never have broken through. It was specifically his doubts, his unanswered questions, and his honest agonising attempts to deal with them, which proved his salvation, as it were. For this man, doubt, far from being destructive of faith, was effectively the midwife, if you like, at the birth of a far more compelling and vibrant faith. His doubts on the traditional Jewish teaching of reward and punishment were not unlike those of many of his fellow psalmists. But in the light of those doubts, he asked different, more searching questions of God, which caused him an even more painful inner conflict. But at the same time, God caused him to break through in his relationship. And that is why generations of Jews and early Christians accepted the Psalms as their worship book. And they would sing the agonies of the Psalm 73 writer and all the others who penned psalms of lament, because lament and doubt, as well as praise and thanksgiving, of course, were a mirror of their own identity and experience. They were just being honest. And anyone who is serious about God experiences doubts, friends. What are we doing to the vibrancy of our faith if instead of voicing our doubts and questions in our worship, we decide to deny that they even exist? Could it possibly be that our failure to bring lament into our acts of worship is one of the reasons why so many people leave the church? They drift away from the church because we lose the ability to lament, to doubt, to question. We stop growing as individuals and as a body. And we have nothing to say to the people in pain all around us. In 1948, a man called Alfred Doblin, he was a very influential writer and essayist, and he said this to an audience in Berlin. He said, "You have to sit in the ruins for a long time and let them affect you and feel the pain and judgment." And it does seem that sometimes the modern church does not want to sit in the ruins. We don't even want to admit that the ruins exist. The witness of the Bible, friends, is that those who are able to lament are those who grow closest to God. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. So let's give more respect to the Psalms. They're not just a load of poems. They were the centerpiece of Israel's liturgy and worship. And the Psalms acknowledge the hiddenness of God. They tell stories of loss and destruction, and they lay bare the human experience in all its joy and pain. And I'll finish with this thought. Wouldn't it be amazing if we went to one of these big Christian conventions, under the big top, where we used to go, like to the Dales Bible Weeks and all these conventions, and we see the worship leader, he gets up onto the stage, he picks up his guitar, and he says this: "Now we're going to sing a song about our feelings that God is miles away. He's just not there. He's gone asleep somewhere." Now, perhaps that wouldn't be a great career move for the worship leader today. But you never know. God just might sweep in to the PA system and say, "My servant has sung right." Amen.
Hey church, wasn't that an amazing session? We're going to be hanging around for a little while in this chat room to discuss some of those topics. If you've got any questions, please feel free to put them out there and we'll aim to get to them as well. So don't forget, we will be back same time, 7 p.m. next Wednesday for Doubt Part 2. Have a great rest of your week.